Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 85, called The Hollow Victory. In the last episode we left Belisarius at the gates of Ravenna, but no one had ever taken the city by storm, since it was protected by impenetrable marshes on its land side and had good access to the sea. Theodoric the Great had only entered it by tricking the German warlord Odoacer into a peace treaty and afterwards treacherously slaying him. However, it was highly unlikely Belisarius could do something similar, so instead all he could do was to starve Wittigis and his Goths into submission, and that would take a long time. First, he needed to stop any reinforcements or provisions of food from reaching Ravenna. Procopius tells us the Goths had prepared a huge number of boats filled with grain on the river Po, ready to sail to Ravenna. But fortunately for Belisarius, there was a severe drought which caused the level of the river to fall to a point where the boats couldn't sail. He also bribed some of Ravenna's inhabitants to burn what grain was stored in the main warehouses in the city. Procopius tells us Wittigis's wife, Matasunta, might have been complicit in this, since she was still waging a secret war against her husband. But Belisarius's most serious potential threat came yet again from the Franks. Rather surprisingly, King Theodebert had persuaded his followers to return to Italy after their disastrous expedition the previous year, when dysentery had killed about a third of them. Now he sent envoys to Wittigis proposing an alliance against the Romans. Once they'd been driven out, he wanted to split Italy between them. But Wittigis had seen the Franks' behaviour the previous summer and wasn't about to be duped a second time. He sent the Frankish envoys away empty-handed. Meanwhile, a Gothic relief force was gathering in the Cottian Alps, the southwestern part of the Alps bordering modern France and Italy. Wittigis's nephew, Euryce, had put together a small army of 4,000 and was ready to march east towards Ravenna to rescue his uncle. But the so-called Bloody John, Belisarius's insubordinate general, for once helped him by boldly attacking the Goths and in a series of lightning raids seized many of the Gothic women and children. He then offered to employ their husbands in the Roman army. Many of the Goths accepted this and joined the Romans. With his forces depleted, Euryce couldn't do anything and stayed in Liguria, which is the area west of modern Genoa. But Belisarius was no nearer taking Ravenna when two senior senators, Domnicus and Maximin, arrived from Constantinople with instructions to conclude a peace as soon as possible by offering Wittigis all the land north of the river Po, with the Romans retaining everything to the south. Why was Justinian so intent on a quick peace? As I mentioned in the last episode, by 539 his focus had shifted away from Italy. Trouble was brewing in other parts of the empire and he needed the soldiers he'd sent to Italy back. This was because, first, the Bulgarian Huns, the descendants of Attila's Huns, launched a devastating raid across the Danube into the Balkans in 539. And second, Justinian was well aware that, goaded by the Gothic envoys sent to him by Wittigis, as I mentioned in the last episode, the Persian Shah Khosroes was about to break the eternal peace he'd signed with him. Justinian needed Belisarius and his army to defend the east, and he needed it now. Indeed, by the time Domnicus and Maximin had reached Belisarius, the Persians had already attacked the Roman fortress of Sura. Justinian had already left it too late. But not surprisingly, given the long time it took for news to travel in this era, Belisarius was oblivious of the developments in the east and in the Balkans. According to Procopius, Justinian's peace offer to the Goths threw him into despair. He felt that 5 long years of warfare had been for nothing, but he couldn't prevent the embassy from going to Ravenna, where Wittigis, astonished by Justinian's generosity, immediately accepted it. This sparked 2 quite extraordinary consequences. First, Belisarius refused to sign the peace agreement. It was his one and only act of insubordination in his entire career. And it prompted an even more outrageous reply from the Goths. Without his signature, they regarded the peace offer as worthless, and discontent was brewing among the Gothic nobility, but not with Belisarius. It was Wittigis who was their target. After all, he'd achieved nothing other than misery for his nation. Meanwhile, their respect for Belisarius had burgeoned. In the siege of Rome, he'd humiliated Wittigis using skill and ingenuity rather than numbers. So they took a quite unprecedented step. They offered him the position of Emperor of the West, reviving the role that had last been occupied by Romulus Augustulus. Procopius tells us the Gothic nobles communicated this secretly to Belisarius without telling Wittigis. But once Wittigis found out, he didn't object. Quite the opposite. He threw his support into the offer. This put Belisarius in a tough position. Procopius says he harboured no wish to be Emperor of the West, but he must have been flattered. Whether or not he was tempted, with his usual decisiveness and loyalty to Justinian, he took full advantage of this offer by telling the Gothic envoys he'd accept, provided they let him and his army into Ravenna in order to take on his new role. Procopius says Belisarius sent the insubordinate John and some other senior officers who were troublemakers away so that they weren't able to denounce him. It's not quite clear what he said to his own soldiers as they marched into Ravenna, but Procopius tells us the Gothic women were clear about what was going on. Quote, "The women spat in the faces of their husbands, for they'd heard from them that the enemy were men of great size and too numerous to be counted. But now they'd seen the entire army that had invested the city, and pointing with their hands to the victors, reviled them for their cowardice." End quote. But even the Gothic women's disgust with their husbands for bowing down to the Romans was placated when a Roman fleet landed at Ravenna's port, Classe, loaded with grain for the starving Goths. The Goths were happy, and now Belisarius sprang his trap. Once inside Ravenna, he told his Gothic supporters he would never betray the emperor, and they were now his captives. Or that's what Procopius tells us. Conspicuously absent from his detailed narrative is a scene describing the reaction of the dumbfounded Goths. All he says is that when they heard Belisarius had tricked them, most of the Gothic nobles left Ravenna to gather at Pavia with Wittigis's nephew Euryce. Meanwhile, Wittigis surrendered without a fight, as did some of his nobles. He allowed Belisarius to seize the Gothic royal treasury, which was said to be huge. It was an astonishing capitulation. But it was not completely unexpected, since Belisarius had sweetened the pill of defeat by offering Wittigis and his family a life of luxury in Constantinople. It was certainly a moment of triumph for Belisarius. He was the conqueror of two barbarian kings, the Vandal king Gelimer and now Wittigis. He'd secured yet another unlikely triumph for Justinian. The emperor immediately recalled him to Constantinople, thinking the job was done in Italy. But appearances can be deceptive, and this time Belisarius's victory was hollow for several reasons. The first was that the job had not been done in Italy. Belisarius had not destroyed the Goths, as he'd done the Vandals. Those nobles who'd fled Ravenna to Pavia to join Euryce eventually declared a new king of the Goths, Hildebald, despite Belisarius taking his children captive in Ravenna. Perhaps for that reason, before Belisarius left Italy, Hildebald and his supporters approached him one more time to offer him the Western crown again. which Belisarius refused. But after that, an independent Gothic state continued to exist north of the River Po, and when Belisarius left for Constantinople, this state not only survived, but prospered, as we will shortly hear. Second, quite separate from Belisarius' Italian campaign, there was a spectacular Roman military collapse in 539 to 540 in both the Balkans and then on the Eastern Front with Persia. In late 539, the Danube front caved in completely when the Bulgarian Huns crossed the river and made a devastating raid through the Balkans. Procopius describes 32 fortresses in Illyria falling to them, 120,000 captives being taken, which was almost certainly an exaggeration, raiding extending as far as the Adriatic Sea in the west to the suburbs of Constantinople itself and the Chersonesus Peninsula, which was the Roman term for the modern Dardanelles, and even down to Thermopylae in Greece and possibly to Athens, since Procopius says it was only the Peloponnese that was spared. This was a shocking breakdown of Roman defences on the Danube front, which can only be attributed to one thing. Justinian had taken troops from this region to send to Belisarius in Italy and to North Africa, where the Berber War was ongoing. But in 539, an even greater threat was brewing in the east, as we'll cover in the next episode. Khosroes was preparing for a war which would result in a complete Persian victory and the destruction of Antioch. So, perhaps it's little wonder that Justinian was frustrated with Belisarius' inability to wrap up the Italian campaign quickly, where 20,000 of the best Roman troops were now concentrated. Certainly, when Belisarius returned to Constantinople in the summer of 540, there was no repeat of the wild celebrations that had marked his return from Carthage in 534. This time, there was no triumphal procession. Procopius tells us Justinian was pleased to see him returning with Wittigis, Hildebad's children, and some Gothic nobles, together with the Gothic treasure, but there was no official celebration and no official recognition awarded to Belisarius. All Justinian did was to display the treasure privately to members of the Senate, claiming the honour of the victory for himself. In contrast, Procopius highlights the reaction of the inhabitants of Constantinople, who didn't have the same reservations about their brilliant soldier. Quote, "Everyone in the city was talking about Belisarius. To him were attributed 2 victories such as never before had fallen to the lot of one man to achieve." End quote. Indeed, his popularity was such that, quote, "the people of Constantinople took delight in watching Belisarius as he came out of his house every day and went to the forum. He had a fine figure and was tall and remarkably handsome." End quote. As you'll hear in future episodes, Justinian's and even more Theodora's envy of Belisarius was aroused by this, and it would end the special relationship that had been integral to the reconquest of North Africa and Italy. For one of the striking features of the 530s had been the unconditional trust Justinian placed in Belisarius. Very seldom have we seen rulers in the Roman or any other period for that matter give such executive authority to their generals. Justinian and Belisarius had been the Lennon and McCartney of the 530s. That partnership was now at an end, and so was the age of reconquest. For almost immediately after his return to Constantinople, Belisarius' conquests in Italy began to unravel. Since he hadn't completely defeated the Goths, there were still thousands of Gothic warriors and their families living freely in the Po Valley, north of Ravenna, which had been the traditional heartland of the Gothic kingdom. As I mentioned earlier, the Gothic nobles who fled Belisarius' occupation of Ravenna had turned first to Wittigis's nephew Euryce, and then, at his suggestion, to Hildebald, who was proclaimed king. But this partnership didn't last long, since, according to Procopius, their respective wives fell out when they visited the baths. When they'd insulted each other over who was the more important, their husbands became even more incensed, and Hildebald murdered Euryce. Hildebald was then himself murdered by the Gothic nobles, who were fed up with his conduct. Procopius has left us with a vivid description of his assassination. His head was cut off so suddenly at a dinner party that his hand was still holding the food he was about to eat when his head hit the ground. The next royal candidate was the leader of the Rugi, a Germanic tribe subject to Gothic rule, whose leader, Araric, was a highly regarded warrior and well liked by the Gothic nobles. But he only lasted for 5 months before he too was assassinated for secretly conspiring to surrender the Gothic kingdom to Justinian in exchange for a comfortable life in Constantinople. Finally, in late 541, the Goths found their man. This was Hildebald's nephew, Totila. Over the next 11 years, Totila proved to be an exceptional leader. Well connected within Gothic aristocratic circles, he also had connections with the Visigothic royal family in Spain, but his main qualification was his martial prowess. He was a brave and skillful warrior, as Procopius described, when one day he advanced up to the Roman lines to display his skills. Quote, "He wheeled his horse around in a circle and then turned him again to the other side, and so made him run round and round. And as he rode, he hurled his javelin into the air and caught it again as it quivered above him." End quote. To help Totila, the Roman administration in Italy imploded after Belisarius left. The moment he was on the boat home, Justinian sent in the tax collectors, led by a notoriously harsh and corrupt administrator called Alexander Snips, because he would snip gold and silver from the edges of coins to keep for himself. Alexander alienated the Italian population by imposing higher taxes than they'd paid under the Goths. He also targeted those who'd prospered under the Gothic administration, requiring them to pay special taxes to make up for their supposedly ill-gotten gains, thereby antagonizing many of the wealthiest and most influential Italian senators. But his most damaging action was to reduce or even to stop the pay to the army of occupation. Justinian had done this in North Africa with disastrous consequences when, as we covered in episode 81, the Roman army in Africa mutinied, causing Belisarius to rush back from Sicily to put down the revolt. Not only was it a very short-sighted tactic to reduce the pay of soldiers who'd fought hard and well, but Justinian had clearly learnt nothing from the North African experience. By doing the same to the army that had fought long and hard in Italy, he caused morale to plummet. Into this cauldron of discontent, Justinian threw one more disastrous ingredient. Procopius says after Belisarius' departure, there were 11 Roman generals in Italy, all of equal rank, with no commander-in-chief. Justinian's strategy to divide and rule in this way was presumably prompted by fears the Goths would repeat the imperial offer they made to Belisarius, to his successor. In this, it succeeded, but it also created a confused Roman high command, as quickly became apparent in the Romans' first engagement with Totila's forces. In the spring of 542, a Roman force of 12,000 men, led by the 11 generals, marched out of Ravenna to take the Gothic-held Verona. A local inhabitant bribed some of the guards guarding the walls to let a small Roman advance party into the city, who opened the southern gates. The Gothic garrison fled, But they returned when they discovered the main Roman army had stopped a few miles from the city, with the 11 different commanders arguing over how to divide the plunder they expected to take from the city. The Goths locked the gates, and the Roman advance guard had to jump from the walls, many of them to their deaths. Meanwhile, Totila had been shadowing the Roman army with a force of 5,000 Goths. At Faenza, he offered battle. He outmanoeuvred the larger Roman force, which lacked cohesion, by sending 300 cavalry to attack the Romans in the rear. The Romans panicked and fled in different directions, following their various generals. The same happened outside Florence, which Totila's army was besieging. A Roman relief force, including John, Belisarius' insubordinate general, as well as some of the other generals, attacked the Goths. Procopius says John's forces attacked first and were doing well until one of his guards was killed right next to him. This caused a panic among John's men, who thought John himself had been killed. They retreated, and the sight of this confusion caused the other Roman commanders to retreat. The Goths sallied forth in pursuit, and the retreat turned into a rout in which many Romans were killed. The demoralized Roman army dispersed under its various generals to garrison the towns Belisarius had occupied, hoping reinforcements would arrive from the east. This break-up of the Roman army made Totila's offensive easier, since he could pick the Roman garrisons off one by one. He marched south, taking the Roman strongholds individually, sometimes by offering generous terms to the defenders who'd often not been paid and were even willing to join the Goths. Totila was not just a good soldier, he was also a clever diplomat. Generosity and restraint became the hallmark of his campaign of reconquest. He stopped his soldiers from looting and treated the Italian inhabitants well. Belisarius himself could not have done better. He bypassed Rome and brought most of southern Italy back under Gothic control. The only real resistance the Romans offered was at Naples, just as had been Belisarius' experience. He besieged it for several months before it too fell in the spring of 543. For once, Totila exacted revenge not on its inhabitants, to whom he was conspicuously lenient, but on its governor, who had delighted in shouting personal insults to Totila from the walls. He cut out his tongue and chopped off his hands. Totila undid nearly all of Belisarius' Italian conquests, and although, as we'll hear in future episodes, he would eventually be defeated and Italy regained, the 540s would be as difficult for the Roman Empire as the 530s had been glorious. Justinian's age of reconquest was over. The storm clouds were gathering over the Roman Empire, and this time its decline would be terminal. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And in the next episode, which will be in a week's time on the 27th of April, we'll continue with the amazing story of the age of Justinian. And in the meantime, if you like the podcast and listen to it on Spotify, I'd be so grateful if you could click the star rating. That would be great. And of course, do also check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes, to find maps, blogs and a free ebook. And don't forget to take a look at my latest book, Rome and Attila, again link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.